So as the title of my talk suggests, I used to be a tax and commercial lawyer for over 10 years. And trust me, it's not as exciting as what you might think based on TV shows and movies. I've worked in both private law firms with small to medium enterprises and also in government, being the one doing investigations and audits. So what inspired this talk was really my experience working with clients who aren't used to working with lawyers. These might be small business owners who just want to do what they're passionate about, but need help when the ATO comes knocking on the door for an audit. Or it could be an employee of a startup company that have been given shares and all of a sudden they need to sign a shareholder agreement and they have no idea what that means for them. A lot of the times when speaking to these clients, legal concepts are like a foreign language. And through working with them over time, I learned how to explain things in a way that makes sense and is relatable to them. Because often as lawyers, all you're doing really is helping people make informed choices by explaining the legal consequences of different options that they have. And when I changed career into cyber and became a governance, risk, and compliance consultant, I started to notice that a lot of the skills I use to explain legal concepts can also be used in cyber as well. And the role for cyber consultant is very similar to lawyers. All we're doing is giving people information about the choices that they're about to make. So the subject matter might be different, but principles are pretty similar. And this demonic creature on my slide is my cat. She might grace us with her presence at some point in the talk, but we'll see. So why do we need to talk about how to translate tax to business speak? Well, how many times have you been in a meeting talking about something fun, like finding from a pen test report or a risk assessment, and you can just tell that the message isn't quite getting across? Maybe you can see people's eyes start glazing over, or you just got a feeling that you're losing them as you're talking. Or maybe you've been on the other end and you're the one listening to someone else talking about something and it just went way over your head and you didn't want to interrupt because you didn't want to look stupid in front of your colleagues. I know personally I've been on both sides of the fence. Often when you're explaining technical concepts, what you're really trying to do is just to get your message across, and your message just happens to have a technical component to it. So I might be explaining to someone that even though it's their company, by law, a company is seen as a separate legal entity. But that's not really the point. The point I need to make is that I need them to stop taking money out of the company bank account like it's their personal account, because that's not how the law works. And I'm explaining the legal concepts so they understand why that's a really bad idea and why there will be legal consequences to what they do. So this presentation won't give you a guaranteed way to get your message across, but what I can give you are things that I've picked up along the way that helped me to do talkings that get my messages across. And while a lot of the things I talk about are helpful when you're talking to clients or stakeholders, some of these concepts are also relevant when you're writing reports, because it's more of a mindset on how you approach a situation rather than actual rules. So let us dive in. Knowing your audience, it's an old one, but a good one. The reason it keeps coming up is because it's really important. And you want to know who you're talking to, their job role, experience, technical knowledge, all that good stuff. But for me, I like to go a little bit deeper than that, hence the FBI profile a bit. So I want to start thinking about at least three things. Number one, why are they here? Did they come to you because they wanted to understand the issues there are in their environment? Or they may be looking for someone independent to come in and help them prove to their management that the money they spent on the cyber program actually achieved something. So understanding their why will help you understand, number two, what do they want out of that conversation that you're having? So this is about their needs and wants. if I'm talking to a client about an ATO audit, what they really care about is the end game. They want to know, would they go to jail? Will they have to fork out $1 million? What's the end game here for them? They don't really care about the law, but explaining the law might need to be done in order to explain to them what the end result or the consequences might be. And number 3, what will appeal to them and what will get through to them? How do we talk in their language? For example, if I'm talking about risk to the CFO, maybe I'll start quantifying things and talking about how much money the company might lose. Or if I'm talking to the legal team, I might emphasize the risk of the company breaching legal obligations because that's something that's in their space that they care about. So going that extra step to understand your audience will help you to start framing your discussion in a way that's suitable to them. And once you understand your audience, you need to work out what's technical to them. There's no line in the sand that tells you what technical is. What's technical to someone might be non-technical to someone else. We want to pitch at the right level. But this gets a lot trickier if you're dealing with people from different backgrounds in the same audience. In that case, you want to make sure you talk in a way that gives some high-level explanation to people that don't know the concepts, but at the same time, not over-explaining it so you don't annoy the people that already knows. I don't know how many of you watch the music quiz show Spicks and Specks on the ABC. When the host Adam Hills asked questions around music artists on the show, he usually would include some information about the artists. So for example, he might ask, what do the following 3 people have in common? 50s crooner Perry Como, 90s queen of pop Madonna, and modern day pop princess Britney Spears. By framing that question this way, it gives people a general idea about the artist if they have no idea who they are. But it also doesn't come across as condescending to the people who know them. And remember, there's no such thing as common sense. What you think is common sense might not be common to everyone. You may think that, well, everyone knows what GitHub is, and you don't need to actually explain what it does. But depending on the crowd that you talk to, that might not be the case. This is the point I can't stress enough. You need to actually understand the thing yourself first before you try to translate or explain it. I don't mean that you need to understand, every single detail before you can talk about it, because then, I won't be doing any talking at all. But at the very least, you need to be comfortable explaining things to the degree that you need for a particular audience or purpose. It's very tempting to parrot words we hear a lot, even if we don't understand it, because we want to fit in and we want to, use the common language of the groups that we're in. But what you don't want is to be caught in a situation where you throw around terms like, zero trust, for example, and then someone turns around and say to you, well, what do you mean by zero trust in this context? Can you explain a bit more? And you've got nothing. This book, Thing Explainer, is a great example. It's written by the creator of XKCD, using the 1,000 most common words to give simple explanation for things like bending computer, aka laptops, skyboats with turning wings, aka helicopters, and shared space house, aka International Space Station. Now, you don't have to go to that extent, but ask yourself, can you explain, for example, what buffer overflow is using English words that a 12-year-old could understand? Because using big words is really easy. I can throw around big words without understanding it. But unless I can explain the big words using simple words, I don't actually understand it at all. Context matters. Remember, we talked about profiling your audience a little bit earlier. During that, will help us build the context and understand why they should care about the thing we're telling them. And to do this, you need to walk in their shoes. There's a reason why you're talking to them in the first place and trying to explain technical concepts. So is it because an incident is happening right now and they need to make a decision based on what you're going to tell them? Or is it because they're the one approving the budget for your next project? Or are you doing security awareness training and you need them to understand why you're telling them to do or not to do something? Nothing exists in a vacuum. And you need to be able to articulate why something is a problem for that particular stakeholder and why you are, or your team have the solution. If you just say to people, we've got legacy infrastructure that's end of life, the business person might think, well, okay, that doesn't sound great, but it's probably not a big deal. It's an IT thing and IT can deal with that. But if instead we say, we've got legacy infrastructure that's not supported by the vendor anymore, which means that the security team might not be able to fix security vulnerabilities going forward. And if those vulnerabilities are exploited, our payroll system that runs on the infrastructure will go down. This means we can't pay our staff, and what's worse, we also can't pay our suppliers. All of a sudden, instead of it being an IT problem, you've just given them a business problem and presented them with a reason to care because it's something that they can relate to and they can picture. And so far, we've talked a lot about preparing and thinking about our audience and context. So it's all stuff that you do beforehand. Now, being prepared is great, but you also need to be flexible and adapt to your audience in the moment. When you're talking to people in a meeting, you might need to change your approach on the fly based on real-time feedback from them. What this means is you need to really pay attention to your audience when you're talking to them and take their cues. You can't just take a rehearsed speech and deliver it. Because when you're writing it, you might think, well, the CEO I'm about to talk to is not technical at all. But 5 minutes into the meeting, you might find out that actually that's not the case. And they want to hear all the glory details about a technical problem. And that's why it's doubly important that you actually understand the thing you're talking about. Because if you don't have that understanding, it will be a lot harder for you to pivot in the moment. So have a plan, but be prepared to change your plan. Build on skills you already have. Most of us probably already have done something like translating complex concept into an easier way of understanding those concepts in a different space. If you've ever tried explaining something to kids, you've probably taken something that's quite complex to the kids and explained it in a way that's age appropriate and most likely not using jargons and big words. For anyone that changed career into cyber, think about what you've done in the past and how you might be able to apply those transferable skills in cyber. This whole talk is about how I've used what I learned working as a lawyer in the cyberspace. But if you worked in retail or hospitality in the past, most likely you would have delivered bad news to customers who weren't happy about it. And you would have had to keep cool and think on your feet when you deal with the fallout. Or if you worked in healthcare, you might have explained some medical terms to patients, and you probably did it with empathy and in a way that people can understand. These are all skills that you can use in one way or another when you're translating tech to business speak. And one skill that often gets talked about these days, which I think is really important, is storytelling. If you watch TED Talks, most of them tell you a story in order to get their point across, because people don't remember dot points in a PowerPoint slides, but they remember stories. If I give you a list of reasons why telling people you're a tax lawyer at parties sucks, you'll probably forget it in 5 minutes flat. But if I told you that one time I was cornered at a wedding by someone who won't let me leave for the bridal party photo shoots because they wanted to know how they can minimize paying capital gains tax on their investment property, that suddenly becomes a funny story and you're more likely to remember it. And that leads me to analogies are your friend. Because if we can picture it, it's a lot easier for us to relate to and understand. Depending on context and the message you need to convey, your analogy doesn't need to be 100% accurate. It just needs to get your point across. So focus on what your message needs to be first, and then build an analogy around it to support the delivery of your message. A lot of you will be familiar with Docker, which is an open source platform that software developers use to build, deploy, and manage containerized applications. But if I'm trying to explain what Docker is to someone with no technology background, I might compare a Docker container to a HelloFresh box, where all the ingredients you need are already packaged neatly in one box, ready to go. If you want to cook the meal at home, or if you want to cook at your friend's place, all you need to do is take that HelloFresh box with you. It's got everything you need and you can make the meal wherever you go. And just like that box, your Docker container would have your source code and your dependencies within it. So you can just take the container and run the code in any environment. Of course, using this analogy might not get all the nuances across, but for someone who's not familiar with the technology, it helps them visualize it and it gives them a flavor of what Docker actually does. And it's also useful to keep in mind that you might be able to build on analogies over time if it's someone that you have an ongoing relationship with. So then you can start to introduce more and more nuances over time once they build up their knowledge. And if you can use analogies that's based on something your audience already knows really well, that's even better. So far, I've given you a few things that I think are important to consider. But you and I are different. We have different backgrounds, experiences, skills. So what works for me may not work for you. And also what works for one situation may not work for another. You may find that certain things work really well for stakeholders who are very casual, but if you use the same thing for someone who tend to be quite formal, that might not work so well, and vice versa. So you need to work out what works for you, your specific audience, and also that particular set of circumstances that you're facing. And that means it's something that you'll need to find out through trial and error, and it might not always work out how you hope it does. And that brings me to my last point. Self-compassion. We won't get it right every time, and that's perfectly okay. You can't be everything to everyone, even if you try really, really hard. We need to accept that different people will perceive us differently. Someone might think that you're too technical and don't understand business in your delivery. And at the same time, someone else in that meeting will think you're not being technical enough. Sometimes there's just no pleasing everyone. And when we do make a mistake, it's really important to be compassionate to ourselves. And instead of beating ourselves up, try to accept that we are human and humans make mistakes. That's just a fact of life. What's more important is how we learn from our mistakes. The quote I have here is from Dr. Kristen Neff, who's a researcher in self-compassion. And she says, if we can compassionately remind ourselves in moments of falling down that failure is part of the shared human experience, then that moment becomes one of togetherness rather than isolation. That's a really powerful quote, and I really highly recommend you look up Dr. Kristen Neff's work. If you only take away one thing from my talk, I want you to remember that if we give ourselves compassion, it will give us room to make mistakes. And that will actually make us more willing to try new things and become better in the process. That's all from me. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Discord. And thank you, ComfyCon, for having me.